proposed rezonings, including the East New York application in Brooklyn, which is the first city-initiated zoning map change, and there will be others, including some in Queens, coming into the public review process. It will also be applied to privately sponsored applications throughout the city. There will be three options which can be applied singly or in combination, as I'll explain. Option one or option two one or the other or both must be applied to any mandatory inclusionary housing area. Option one requires that 25% of the housing be affordable at incomes averaging 60% AMI. And we can see to the right what these income levels are for a family of three. Option two requires that 30% of the housing be affordable at an average of 80% AMI. There is an additional option which can be included in any given rezoning, in addition to either option one or two, or both options one and two. And that is called the workforce option. And that option requires that 30% of the units be affordable at an average of 120% AMI. And that workforce option is intended in areas that where housing market conditions are such that the kind of deep red skewing which is necessary to make options one or two work is really not feasible given local housing market conditions. And those include both moderate income areas, including many areas of Queens, and areas where the market is sort of emerging and changing as a higher income population comes into an area. Other important features of the mandatory inclusionary housing program include the requirement that the affordable units be permanent. It applies to developments in large portions of existing buildings or conversions from non-residential to residential that are greater than 10 units. And there's a square footage equivalent to that, which is 12,500 square feet. The affordable units may be on-site in the same building. They may be on-site in a building which is adjacent to the building that has the market rate units. It has to be independent from the ground to the sky, and it has to be designed in such a way that HB finds it doesn't stigmatize the residents of affordable units. Or it could be off-site on a different zoning lot located within the same community district or a half mile from the site. There's some other important considerations. There is a payment in lieu option for small projects where it would be administratively impractical to require a small number of affordable units. And the requirements could be reduced or waived upon a finding of hardship by the BSA. And this is really necessary in any mandatory inclusionary housing program to make it legally valid. As I mentioned before, mandatory inclusionary housing works with many other components of the mayor's housing plan. Key aspects include the reform of the 421A program and the expansion of the 10-year capital plan and the availability of city housing subsidies in those areas where new housing really requires housing subsidies to be affordable. And in addition, the zoning for quality and affordability proposal addresses a number of aspects of zoning that unnecessarily increase the cost of new housing, and Laura will now talk about that proposal. Process, we're now in public review. We're in the non-ULURP text amendment procedure. It was referred for 60 days by the Planning Commission for review by community boards, borough boards, and borough presidents. That period ends on November 30th. After that, there will be a City Planning Commission review, which will be about 60 days, although there's no formal time limit. And then after the City Planning Commission's vote, the City Council will have 50 days to review this text amendment.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more now about the zoning for quality and affordability text amendment. We have two components to this as the title implies, quality and affordability. I'm going to talk through the affordability portion first. We have three major goals as part of this component of the proposal. The first, help seniors remain in their communities by making it easier to provide affordable senior housing and care facilities, support the creation of inclusionary housing, and free up resources to create more affordable housing by enabling cost-effective, transit-accessible affordable housing. So first, speaking on affordable senior housing, why does the zoning need to change? Eric mentioned this earlier, but with an average lifespan increasing, the population age 65 and older in Queens alone is projected to increase by 30% by 2040, and this amounts to almost 90,000 additional seniors in this borough alone. Today's zoning doesn't really recognize the spectrum of senior housing and care facilities that we see throughout the country and that we'd like to see more of in the city. These include things like independent living facilities, assisted living, and nursing care. In our medium and higher density zoning districts today, although we provide affordable senior housing with more floor area, we don't actually modify the building envelope to allow a developer to fit that floor area within a well-designed building. And in our lower density multifamily districts, the zoning envelope is based on walk-up houses, but we know that seniors need elevator buildings, and these are really impractical or impossible to build as of right in these lower density districts. So in our medium and higher density zoning districts, we want to update regulations to allow a spectrum of affordable senior housing and care facilities, either standalone or mixed. When buildings provide affordable senior housing, we want to allow limited additional height to fit all of the floor area into a well-designed building. We don't want developers to have to sacrifice design for the quality of life for these residents. And we also want to allow the same higher floor area for affordable senior housing as well as care facilities. So one of the reasons why it's very hard to put these two uses under the same roof today is that we have different bulk regulations for the two, and we want to equalize all of them and make it easier and sort of more straightforward how to develop a building that has a variety of senior care uses under the same roof. So how much height really are we talking about? This is an existing R7A envelope on a narrow street. We've modeled out what an affordable senior housing development looks like. The existing envelope can't really be accommodated, the existing floor area can't really be accommodated in the existing envelope. You're left with a sort of flat facade, low floor to ceiling heights, lower than desirable ground floor, if you want to be able to squeeze all of the floor area in. So what we're proposing to do in medium and high density districts, allow 1 to 2 additional stories depending on the zoning district. Doing this will enable you to provide better floor to ceiling heights, better ground floor, sort of pedestrian level floor to ceiling heights, residential lobbies or commercial space. The more flexible envelope allows for a better design building. You can have things like articulation in courtyards. And one of the things that we would be doing as part of this proposal, although we'd be granting an additional 1 to 2 stories of height or an additional 10 to 20 feet in height, we would be capping the overall number of stories. So there would be no sort of backdoor way for a developer to obtain the extra height, but then fit in additional stories and sort of result in the same bad interior conditions as we're seeing today. So in our lower density zoning districts, again, we're updating the regulations to allow a spectrum of care facilities under the same roof. For the lower density districts, we want to allow affordable senior apartment buildings with an elevator not to exceed 4 to 6 stories. And again, we'd be reconcile the floor area ratios and the bulk regulations for independent living, affordable senior housing, nursing home, assisted living, to enable these types of facilities to be developed under the same roof. So today, the way it works is, as I mentioned earlier, you have a building envelope in our lower density multifamily districts that really resembles a walk-up family house with a pitched roof. This as of right option doesn't work for affordable senior housing and other types of senior care facilities where you really do need an elevator to assist the seniors as they go about. We have a discretionary action available to exceed the height and to develop a building that looks sort of like the dotted line you see in this massing. The only time we really see affordable senior housing or senior housing in general being built in these zoning districts is by this discretionary action. So what we're proposing to do is make that as of right. Like I said, buildings would not be allowed to exceed 4 to 6 stories, but you'd get an envelope that works for this type of housing. So moving on to inclusionary housing, why does the zoning need to change? It's a very similar argument for the affordable independent residences for seniors. We provide a higher floor area ratio today as an incentive to develop these uses or these households, but the zoning doesn't allow the room to fit it all in a well-designed building in the existing building envelope. So as a result, under the voluntary program, we simply see less participation and less affordable housing developed. So what we want to do, again, similar to what we'd be doing for the affordable independent residences for seniors, is when buildings participate in the inclusionary housing program, we'd like to allow the same height as proposed for buildings providing affordable senior housing. So again, in the vast, vast majority of zoning districts where this would be applicable, and it's about 95% throughout the city, we would like to provide or allow 1 to 2 stories of additional height, so long as the building is providing affordable inclusionary housing. So this would apply where the voluntary inclusionary housing program applies today, and also where any new mandatory inclusionary housing program is applied in the future. So as Eric mentioned, there are none of these districts mapped today under the mandatory inclusionary housing program, but where they are mapped in the future, they'd be subject to the proposed height changes. And one more thing I want to say about this before I get onto the parking is that where a certain amount of additional height is allowed, we would have certain requirements, design requirements, that the ground floor be 13 feet from floor to floor, to ensure that some of the things that we're hoping to accomplish through the higher heights, better ground floors, better floor to ceiling heights, is actually locked in if you are going to obtain the additional height. Now moving on to the third component of the affordability piece, transit accessible affordable housing and parking requirements. Why does zoning need to change? Our current parking requirements make it harder to meet the need for affordable housing. To develop off-street structured parking, it can cost between $30,000 and $50,000 per parking space. This is assuming that a developer has to excavate below grade and provide all sorts of reinforcement in order to build the spaces. As a result of the high cost of providing the parking, it typically costs a lot of money to park in the space in order to recoup the cost of building it. This can be $200 to $300 a month, which we know that residents of affordable housing typically can't pay or are unwilling to pay. So as a result, we see residents of affordable housing typically choosing to park on street instead. This is obviously not limited to affordable housing residents. I think a lot of market rate residents also would prefer to sort of circle the block rather than pay a couple of $100s a month. On top of this, we see lower rates of car ownership among low-income households, especially in the areas where we're proposing the transit zone. These are our densest parts of the city. They typically have access to a subway and multiple bus lines. Development is most expensive in these areas. Again, it's typically infill. You don't have large lots where you can just sort of pave a parking lot and have it be done. And what we've heard from operators, we've done a lot of outreach with operators of affordable housing and affordable senior housing that have corroborated our findings that low-income residents rarely park in these facilities and they seek on-street spaces instead. We know that despite the fact that lower-income households own fewer cars, they still do own cars, and we're not suggesting that they either give up their cars or are going to give up their cars, but they're simply not using the off-street spaces that we're requiring through zoning. So we've heard from Catholic Charities of Brooklyn and Queens. They're the largest developer of affordable housing for low-income seniors in New York City, and they've told us we have thousands and thousands of low-income seniors on our wait list for housing. We even have wait lists for our tenant gardens. We do not have a single wait list for parking. So what we're proposing to do, as I sort of alluded to earlier, is designate a transit zone. These are areas where auto ownership and commutes by car are lowest. In which parking would be optional for new inclusionary housing or low-income housing. This includes low-income senior housing. And where appropriate, we would also allow for the removal of parking for existing affordable senior housing. And then by discretionary action on a case-by-case basis, we would allow affordable or mixed-income housing a reduction of the requirements for the market rate units possible. But again, this would be a case-by-case discretionary action. So the transit zone, as we're proposing it across the city, it includes only multifamily zoning districts. These are the densest neighborhoods in the city. There are a variety of public transportation options. They're generally within a half mile of a subway station. This geography really reflects the existing low car ownership rates among the affected households within the transit zone. And although we're calling it a transit zone and we're talking about distance to a variety of public transportation options, I think looking at these neighborhoods, it sort of becomes clear that the low car ownership rates are as much about the variety of public transportation options as they are about the variety of services and goods that are accessed within the neighborhood. It's a different sort of lifestyle than you see when you get out into some of the lower density districts further away. So that's the affordability piece. I have a couple more slides on the quality side. We have three major goals for this portion as well. The first, to encourage better ground floor retail and residential spaces and apartments with adequate ceiling heights. Change the rules that lead to flat dull apartment buildings to encourage visual variety and features common in traditional apartment buildings. And we want to maintain the rules that work well today, including the essential rules of contextual zoning districts and lower density zoning districts. So I mentioned that we see sort of a trade-off in affordable housing and quality buildings, which is one reason why we're proposing to give additional height to the affordable housing. We see, to a lesser extent, that same problem replicating itself simply for market rate units. So we have a few components of this proposal that we'd like to help affect market rate as well as affordable. So again, we see flat, dull buildings with bad ground floors in some of our medium and high density contextual districts. Back when contextual zoning was first created in the 1980s, there were a lot of assumptions made about how buildings would get developed that we see have evolved over the past 30 years. In addition to some sort of design aesthetics that have evolved over the past 30 years, we also have things like ADA compliance that wasn't really a factor back in the 80s. And so today, we haven't updated our building envelope for contextual districts, but we have additional things that have to fit in a building, and it just becomes harder and harder to fit the floor area within this envelope when you're also, forced to put in things like ADA accessible ramps, which of course I think we all